We're totally booked.
Rock and roll!
Well, I think I'll leave you to your reading.
Little Hand says it's time to rock and roll.
Rock and roller!
We are totally booked.
Welcome back to Booked on Rock, the podcast for those about to read and rock. Online at bookedonrock.com. Every episode in both audio and video, exclusive video segments, a blog, the latest rock book releases, and check out the all-new Booked on Rock store. This episode's guest is Eric Drooker, the author of the new graphic novel titled Naked City. In this long-awaited graphic novel from Drooker, three bohemians, a painter, a street dancer, and an aspiring musician, struggle to answer the question, is it possible for an artist to survive in the 21st century? Drooker's drawings and posters are a familiar sight in the global street art movement, and his paintings appear frequently on covers of The New Yorker. His editorial illustrations have been seen in Nation, The New York Times, The Progressive, and more. His first book, Flood, a novel and pictures, won the American Book Award, followed by Bloodsong, soon to be a major motion picture. His graphic novels have been translated into 7 languages. After designing the animation for the film Howl, Drooker was hired by DreamWorks Animation. His art is in the permanent collections of many museums, including the Whitney Museum, the Museum of Modern Art, the Brooklyn Museum, and the Library of Congress. Let's talk to Eric Drooker now about his brand new book, Naked City. Eric, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me today.
A fellow Eric with a C. I like it.
Yes,
I
say Eric C's unite.
That's right.
Later for those Erics with a K. No, they need to get to the back of the bus.
They gotta go with the C. Gotta go with the C.
Yeah.
You not only wrote this book, but you also do the illustrations. And the word that came to mind when reading the book and seeing these illustrations is stunning. I guess, I don't know. I was trying to come up with an even better word to describe it. It's absolutely phenomenal. I loved it.
Thanks. Do you read many other graphic novels or?
Not many. I'm usually reading the autobiographies, biographies, things like that. And to have the images in front of me, it flowed. The images are outstanding. And that's what I wanted. I started on a Sunday morning and I thought, well, I'll finish the rest tonight or during the week. I was done by noon. I was done by noon. I loved it.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. So it was a page turner, in other words.
A page turner, absolutely.
That's what.
Before I ask you about the storyline, writing and illustrating is something you've been doing for a while now. Tell us about how you got into a career in illustration.
Well, it was when I was a young man out of art school. I went to Cooper Union. It was a scholarship, and it was free, and it was right in the neighborhood, right there on the Lower East Side. And it was after I got out that I didn't really know, how am I going to continue to pay my rent? I was living in a cheap tenement on the Lower East Side, and I thought, well, I should be able to somehow make a living with my artwork somehow. And I may not be the brightest candle on the cake, but I'm not stupid. In fact, I'm kind of clever in certain regards. I should be able to figure out a way of making a few dollars every day. After all, I'm not being paid very much to work here in this office building under fluorescent lights, or doing market research, or doing my job before that. I was working in a printing factory on my feet all day. They weren't paying me very much anyway. So I should be clever enough to figure out a way of making that much money just on my own, through my artwork. So that's how I started out. I was a street peddler. I just took my artwork directly on the streets. This is back in New York from an earlier era when, well, the police wouldn't hassle you as much back in those days. I mean, the police have been totally militarized in recent years, as we know. But also the rent was more affordable then. I think more importantly, people like, well, even artists and musicians were able to afford New York City rent. Maybe not on Park Avenue or Madison Avenue, but There were so many neighborhoods in New York that were affordable, like the Lower East Side or Harlem or Bedford Stuyvesant or Hell's Kitchen. I mean, when I was growing up, New York City was still primarily a working class industrial city, as difficult as that is to believe now. But there were still factories, small manufacturing when I was a kid. And there were all these neighborhoods that were affordable. The rich folks, but they lived uptown. They were up there on Fifth Avenue, living in Trump Tower or some penthouse somewhere. But it was understood that that was just a small 1% of the population. I think it still is 1% of the U.S. population. But a lot of those rich people have decided to all move to Manhattan Island in the last couple of decades, or San Francisco, or Paris.
Which is where you're now? You're in San Francisco?
I'm spending most of my time in Berkeley. I'm in Berkeley, California,
Okay.
which is a nice break from a lifetime in Manhattan Island. But yeah, I kind of do a lot of back and forth now. I divide my time between East Coast and West Coast.
So early on, you decided.
Inspiration. I mean, even though I'm living here on the West Coast for much of the time, the new book, Naked City, right? It all takes place. It's New York City. That's not San Francisco or Los Angeles. That's definitely the East Coast. That's pretty explicit New York City. So to answer your question, Eric, that was the big surprise is as I'm living out here on the West Coast, but my artwork is still all about New York City. It seems like the farther away I get from home, the more absorbed I am with the New York City landscape.
Interesting.
It's interesting, and I didn't see it coming. It's as if isn't there a line from a Tom Waits song? I never saw the East Coast until I moved to the West. He kind of hit the nail right on the head. I felt like I never had that perspective. When you're born and raised in a place, especially a metropolis like New York City, you can never really quite see it for what it is. You're literally born in the middle of it. It's like being born in the middle of a swarming beehive.
Yeah, well, it's like living in a particular decade, and you don't realize how cool that decade may be until later years. Like, I wish I lived in the 40s and 50s, and my parents were like, yeah, I was there. I lived through it. It was great, but it was like you're in the moment. You're just living day to day. So
yes.
You're not thinking you're not looking to say, whoa, we have some really cool clothing styles, and the automobiles look really cool. You're just living day to day.
Right. In fact, you're not even thinking of it as like the 50s or during World War II. We weren't, calling it World War II. It was just the war, the catastrophe. I think these labels, they come years later. We put a label on them, but at the moment, we're just living. We're living in it. We're in the moment, as it should be.
So getting back to the initial question was, what got you into illustrating? So you just thought, you know what, I can figure out a way to make a living off of this. What inspired you? Did you have
I was hustling. I've always been a hustler, and I think you need to be a hustler in order to make a living, to support oneself and one's art, whether it's as a rock and roll musician or a poet or a dancer or a journalist or anything. And I suppose even an architect at this point. You really need to be a hustler in this culture. It's not only is it extremely competitive, but it's not compensated. We're not really paid. I think part of the culture, the cultural stereotype is that, oh, you're an artist. Well, you're used to being you're a starving artist. Artists are used to being underpaid. It's like this self-fulfilling prophecy. Musicians, they're always going to be struggling and living out, and living up in Harlem or somewhere like like Thelonious Monk did. It just gets reinforced over and over again, and one day I ran into a friend who went to Cooper Union with me, another artist friend who I was always thought was one of the best. Was able to just draw like he had this enviable style. It was part cartoony, but he was able to draw realistically as well. And he told me that he was starting to get a job. It wasn't a full-time gig, but he was getting work just doing cartoons and little editorial illustrations for this newspaper. There were so many more newspapers back then. I mean, print media has been on a downward spiral, but that's a whole other story. But I guess it ties into what the larger economic picture that we're discussing. But my friend was getting part-time work doing the drawings, doing these illustrations. And I said, really? Where? Are they still hiring? I said, oh, yeah, just come on by. Here's the guy's number. He's the art director. Just show him your stuff. If he likes your style, maybe he'll toss some work in your direction. So I suppose that's how it started. I was doing illustrations for a newspaper. It was called The Guardian. It was in Lower Manhattan. Their office was a couple of blocks from Union Square, right by Union Square Park. So it was in close walking distance to my house. Anyway, that my tenement where I was living was in that general neighborhood. In fact, I was born and raised in the same 12-block radius. I realized until I moved out here to the Bay Area, until the age of 40, I had lived my entire life in the same 12-block radius. That is the neighborhood of Tompkins Square Park, the Tompkins Square district, East 14th Street. It was the Lower East Side when I was growing up, but by the 1970s, 80s, the landlords rebranded it the East Village. They came up with a new, less frightening title for the white middle class people who would be terrified to go anywhere near the Lower East Side. But many neighborhoods in New York have gone through that transformation, and I assume other U.S. cities too. Things get renamed every few decades, and it's always named by the landlord. Real estate usually is who gets to rename an entire quadrant of the city, like Hell's Kitchen, where my uncle Leo was born and raised. That's West 42nd Street, Times Square. But if you keep going west, that's the neighborhood of Hell's Kitchen. It was renamed Clinton, the Clinton district, by real estate. And they're not talking about Bill Clinton or Hillary Clinton. It was, I don't know, they probably named it after some big real estate mogul, Mr. Clinton. But a lot of us still call it Hell's Kitchen because, hey, come on, why would you want to give up a name like that? It's not going to get any better than that.
That's what I remember.
Surprised why didn't they just rebrand it and keep the name and just call it like the new improved, the newly sanitized, upscale, deluxe, the deluxe Hell's Kitchen.
Brand new iteration of Hell's Kitchen.
Come on.
Hey, do you remember Katzenjammer? That comic?
Yes, well, I mean,
okay. Because my dad's uncle, Mike Senich, was one of the.
Oh, really? Wow.
Yeah, he wasn't the original guy. I think the original guy passed away, and then he took over. But this was before I was born. My dad used to visit him.
Artists took over. The same thing happened with certain characters like Popeye, the original artist, L.Z. Seeger, who invented Popeye the Sailor Man and olive oil and Bluto and the whole Thimble Theater, as he called it, when it was a newspaper strip back in the 1920s and 30s. But he did it for decades, and then he got old and sick and died. But people were still jonesing for Popeye. They wanted to read Popeye the next day in the newspaper, so they hired someone else to do it.
You artist,
keep the ball rolling for the next couple of decades. It was never nearly as good as those early Popeye strips. But it was the same thing with the Katzenjammer kids. I think started out, it was a German artist. It was this kind of German slang was used. The Katzenjammer kids, when German immigrants, when German was the big ethnic group in New York City before African Americans showed up during the Great Migration, or Italians and Jews showed up in the teens, or the turn of the century. In the late 19th century, it was German. The underclass was German immigrants. The Lower East Side, before it was a Jewish or Puerto Rican neighborhood, it had been an Irish neighborhood, but then for several decades it was a German neighborhood. And I think that was the era that the Katzenjammer kids grew out of. And I always loved it. Was way before my time, but I always loved studying that as a famous example of comic art. One of the
cool,
great
yeah.
comic strips in history. Just like a painter would study Picasso and Rembrandt and Da Vinci, a comic book artist or a graphic novelist is going to study not only R. Crumb and Art Spiegelman and people like that, but they're going to study Winsor McCay and George Herriman, who created Crazy Cat back in the 1920s. And the Katzenjammer kids, I think, was even a little bit earlier than that. I think that's back in the teens, like the turn of the 20th century. That's what they were reading. But the artwork is just phenomenal. I mean,
I have some of it. My dad left some of it.
That since.
Yeah, my dad left me some of his stuff, and it's cool. I go onto Wikipedia, and there's Mike Senich. She's like, oh, cool. That's my dad's uncle.
It looks a little bit. The only thing that looks that wild was really the early Mad magazine or Mad Comics back in the 50s was very influenced by Katzenjammer kids, and kept that over the top madcap style going. So you'll still see in Mad magazine, even a little bit to this day, is still influenced by that school of cartooning, of really the wacky, over the top school.
Boy, you'd love here in Connecticut. They have Barker Animation, where they have a lot of that. All those legendary artists, all of their work is in there, and it's really, really cool.
It's a cartoon museum.
Cartoon museum, and remember they had the artist just before he passed away who did Betty Boop. Mm-hmm. And I remember he was out there in the backyard giving a speech.
The Fleischer Studios that were on the Lower East Side. Max Fleischer and his brother David Fleischer. I think they eventually moved down to Florida to a sunnier place. Disney was out in California, but the Fleischer brothers, all Jews that they were, they moved down to Miami and moved the whole comic studio, the animation studio, with them. But yeah, I always think that Betty Boop cartoons are some of the great cartoons, and they always took place in what looked like the Lower East Side. They were all in black and white, and the background was always urban tenements behind them.
Booked on Rock Podcast. We'll be back after this.
I'll make a note of it.
Many great characters, obviously, like Spider-Man and Superman is Metropolis is New
That's
York
right.
City. I mean, there's something about New York City. There's something about it that just draws people to it storyline.
It's true, and that whole culture. If you study the culture of graphic novels, which has its roots in comics, the comic strip was a very American art form. The way cinema, movies, really evolved here in Hollywood with people like Chaplin and Buster Keaton and Max Sennett and some of those early directors. And it was right around the same era too, back around in the teens and in the 20s, that the comic strips evolved. And just like, with music, with rock and roll music, you could see how it has many roots, but one of the undeniable roots is the blues, which was not urban. That goes down south to the Mississippi Delta and places like that, and Texas, and rural, has roots in rural America, and with the black population, and that you could trace it all the way back to slavery, trace it back to Africa if you really want to get analytical about the musical form of the blues. But of course, as you well know, that was only one of the roots one of the big ones, but there were other roots, and there was rockabilly, there was the whole Appalachian influence, there was marching band influence, there was the jazz influence.
I've got
Many different things went into the mix.
a book on Carl Perkins that I'm going to be covering soon. The author's coming on to talk. That's rockabilly. There we go. He's the king of rockabilly right there.
Yeah.
So yeah,
I love all those earliest recordings of Sun music. Sam
oh
Phillips.
yes, exactly.
Those are my favorite. I mean, my favorite Elvis recordings by far are those very first ones. That's all right. That's
you know what's interesting? Those two guys were kind of neck and neck, and then I read the book and realized Carl Perkins got into this terrible car accident. And he was sidelined for a while, and then all of a sudden, Elvis had the #1 single with I can't remember, Heartbreak Hotel, and then Blue Suede Shoes. Carl Perkins #2, and then all of a sudden Elvis took off because Carl Perkins was laid up.
He was out of commission for a little while, but
Yeah.
all those early recordings, Jerry Lee Lewis, Johnny Cash, Howlin' Wolf. I mean, it was some of the seminal recordings. So I'm sure you get into this on many of your shows. So just on a parallel track with the art form that I practice, graphic novel, sequential art, whatever you want to call it, comics, as I like to call it. The roots of comics, it's really, it's just picture storytelling. That goes way back. It's older than written art form. We've been drawing pictures on the walls of caves for 30, 40,000 years now. So we've been drawing pictures, in other words, for much longer than we've been writing words or adding the word balloons or the captions. That's a more recent technology that we've added into the mix. But even just in our lifetimes, in the last 20 or 30 years, comic books like whether it's Spider-Man or Mad Magazine has continued to evolve and get more and more ambitious and try to attempt to tell longer stories, longer form narratives, and that's really what graphic novels are.
Fascinating. I love it.
All a graphic novel is really just a glorified it's a comic book that's not 32 pages or 64 pages. It's maybe 200 pages, or Naked City, my latest, is 336 pages.
It's like a Netflix series. It's like taking a movie and expanding it into a big, longer series where you can spread out the storyline. You have 3 main characters in this book, right? Naked City. Let's talk about that. Talk about the storyline. The book opens with the main character, Isabel. She's the
protagonist, is a young woman. I don't think she gives her age. I don't remember.
I don't think she's around, I'm assuming maybe 19, 20 years old, maybe,
something
right?
like that. That's what I was shooting for, it's the first time leaving home. We don't learn till later on in a flashback why she suddenly had to leave her home. But she hitchhikes. We see her on the highway, and she's hitchhiking to New York.
Cold December morning.
Yes, that's freezing cold. And she realized once she's out on the frosty highway that maybe December might not have been the best time to try to thumb a ride. But she's out there, and she gets picked up. She gets picked up a bunch of times by these sleazy characters that she keeps having to get out of the car. Finally, she realizes, you know what? I'm not going to go into a car unless it's being driven by a woman.
Nice Jamaican woman.
Right. No. I don't. Last thing I wanted is to be picked up by some psycho. It's already a sketchy situation. I'm here all by myself. So she's hitchhiking from Detroit to New York City, which is it's not all the way across the country, but that's a good long distance hitchhike. That would be a long walk, especially on a cold winter day. And yes, she manages to get picked up by this Jamaican lady who's very friendly to her, and she drives her all the way to New York. She's the Jamaican woman is on her way to see her son in Brooklyn, I think for the winter holidays. But she drops Isabel off in the middle of Manhattan, right in the middle of a blizzard. It's this whiteout blizzard where it's snowing so hard she can't even see a goddamn thing. 3 weeks later, she lands her first gig. Well, an open mic, actually, a hole in the wall in Brooklyn, but it's her first chance to sing in front of a live
It's a
audience.
paid gig.
And she's really right. She's paid, and that she gets to pass her hat around the audience afterwards. In that regard, it's a paid gig, but she's
Yeah.
totally excited that she's getting.
It's like she's
paid.
busking almost in a way, but it's an official.
Right. That's right.
It's in a
And
club.
then we see her later in that first chapter singing on street corners, playing down in the subway station in chapter 2. So yeah, it's really the story of a young busker, someone who's trying to make a living as a street musician.
Is she somebody based on a real person in your life, Isabel?
She's based on a couple of people I know, a couple of musicians and just young women, one of whom actually did hitchhike all the way across the country with her dog and made it to Philadelphia, where she took over a building, was squatting and had an entire building to herself, fixed it up and invited a bunch of friends in to help her fix it up. And they did all the plumbing themselves. They put up the sheetrock themselves. That's when I met her, when she was inviting people in. So I guess Isabel is a composite character of a few different, couple of old girlfriends I had, and just musicians, young musicians I knew, male and female, who were trying to make a living and playing on the street if necessary.
There's a significance to the title Naked City. In the book, the characters are literally naked, but also revealing themselves completely. Viewing it from the aspect of a fan of music, that's what makes the greatest artist so great, I would say. Revealing all of yourself, risking it all with either no fear or just pushing through that fear for the sake of your art. Talk about the significance of the
Well, yes,
naked.
I think maybe you put your finger on it for a moment. This is what a recent definition a working definition that I came up with just in the last couple of months of what an artist, a true artist, is someone who doesn't have a safety net, or someone who lets go of that. Right? Most artists, they keep their day job because it's too dangerous. It's too dangerous to operate without a safety net, especially in the 21st century. This is a question that not just Isabel, but the other two artists in the story, they ask. These three bohemians, they're all asking the same question. Is it possible to survive as an artist in the 21st century? It's always been difficult, right? It's always been challenging at any time in history. Just ask Vincent van Gogh. But it's never been quite like this as it is in the 21st century, where I don't know too many artists who could afford to pay their rent or afford to pay for art supplies. And, the meager, if we're even going to call it a salary that an artist makes. But so that's one working definition. As an artist, is someone who's gonna let go of their safety net and put all of their eggs in that one basket, come hell or high water. And that is, an artist is someone. I put myself in this category. Okay, sometimes they pay me really well if I do a cover for the New Yorker magazine. Hell, one cover will pay my rent for the full year. That's great. Ching, ching. We're in the money.
Right.
But then most of the time, most of the gigs don't pay that well. And I realized that, hey, you know what? It's not really about the Benjamins. For the true artist, I think would be doing it anyway. The true artist, whether a musician or a visual artist, are people who would be doing this activity anyway. It's wonderful when someone pays you and, hey, I could pay the rent all up front this time and pay my utilities and buy food all at the same time. This is great. But you know what? I would have been doing this anyway. I would have been working on this song and working on my music and waking up and playing scales and going through this life of a musician anyway.
I'm so glad you said that.
It
Because
wasn't
nowadays,
really about the money. That's just the gravy. If someone pays for it, that's gravy.
because musicians nowadays, a lot of them that have been around for a while will say, why bother making a new album? Because I'm not going to make any money off of it because of Spotify and et cetera, et cetera. But isn't that who you are? Don't you love making music? Don't you want to create?
Yes,
So there are
it's
some
true.
artists who do.
And it's a reality that we can't ignore. There is the economic reality,
Sure.
and it was easy for me to say, hey, I'm just going to be living here in my tenement, and somehow I could scrape by. I just sell my work on the street if necessary. I could beg, steal, or borrow to pay the landlord when next time he comes knocking. Yeah. That was easy for me to say when I was a young man. What about when you start getting into your 30s or 40s and you have a kid or two who need to be fed? Then these other realities start to sink in. Well, am I going to be able to really devote enough time on my art to really think of myself as an artist, or am I just it's going to really be about the day job, and maybe I'll just paint a little bit on Sundays.
Booked on Rock podcast. We'll be back after this.
When? Oh, patience, my dear, patience. Remember, absence makes the heart grow fonder.
Isabel poses nude for a painter for money. His character is interesting because I'm wondering if he's somebody you can trust, or are his intentions purely artistic, which they are. But at the beginning, I think,
we don't know that at first.
Right? Yeah.
Believe
this character. Who's he based on? Anybody specific in your life?
Yeah. Again, he's a composite. I mean, he's largely based on yours truly. The way I draw him.
I wondered. Okay.
Kind of
I couldn't help but love the character.
He's a caricature of myself, or he's kind of a younger, more naive version of myself, I suppose. But he's the comic character. He's the comic relief in a story that otherwise is fairly serious. I mean, Isabel's story is in many ways pretty tragic. I mean, as we learn more about her, as the chapters go by, and she starts telling us some of her we see some flashbacks of why she had to leave the Midwest and Detroit in such a hurry. We realize that, whoa, she's kind of deeply, deeply traumatized from childhood, and she's really running scared, like many Americans are nowadays. So that story which is really the protagonist's story, was so serious. I thought, if I'm going to tell the story, I've got to balance it out with some humor, just to make it entertaining, because otherwise I feel like we're living in such bleak times. Are we not? I just didn't feel like I wanted to just be creating a work of art that was bleak. I feel like my first two graphic novels in this trilogy, the first two were I would call them tragedies. They were full blown. It's not a comic book. It's a tragic book.
Yeah, I'd love to read those two now, having read this one. The other two
tragedy, but the artwork is very, very beautiful. So those are also page turners. Tragedy is also, there's something very cathartic about that, and I have no doubt that many artists are working on their masterpieces now that are works of tragedy, and maybe my next story will be tragedy. But for this one that I worked on these last several years, all through the pandemic years, I was very consciously making it a comedy. This in the trilogy, I want the final volume is going to leave them laughing, or at least leave them with a hopeful ending.
Ironic humor sometimes too, when you think about the guy, the window washer.
Yes, that's right.
So is that Flood and Bloodsong? Are those
are the first two, right?
Yeah.
Flood.
Now one of them is going to be a major motion picture, from what I understand. Bloodsong
is being made right as we speak. It's in post-production, they tell me, in Southeast Asia. The whole story takes place in what looks like Vietnam or Thailand or somewhere like that. We couldn't be certain because there are no words in the story. This is one of my wordless experiments, a 300-page experiment, but no captions, no word balloons. So we're never told explicitly where we are, but we could see that we're in some kind of tropical landscape, but that definitely south of the border. A few years after the book came out, I was contacted by a young man, a young filmmaker who wanted to direct a feature-length film of Bloodsong. And he started working on it, and he's most of the way through, and he's being very faithful to the original source material. I couldn't believe it. This is someone who doesn't even hardly speak English, and yet he was able to follow the story without any difficulty because it's wordless, right? It's a silent narrative, like a silent movie.
Yeah.
Of course, even a silent Chaplin film is going to have an occasional caption telling you what's happening. This is purely graphic novel, right? There's no word balloons, no captions, but I'm giving enough information in each illustration as you go from panel to panel, from page to page. People, I find, are able to follow the story without any difficulty. In fact, they don't even need to speak English, or that language is not any kind of hang-up. It's more of a universal story. Well, like music. It's a universal language. If you start adding lyrics to it, well, okay, only some people are going to be able to understand literally what they're saying, but they could still enjoy the sound and the rhythm of it. So I guess I was very influenced by music. For all three of these books have music as one of the primary themes woven through the entire trilogy.
Booked on Rock Podcast. We'll be back after this.
The outlook is rosy. The future is bright.
Who were the artists that you grew up listening to that inspired you?
Well, it's a pretty eclectic, motley crew of music that I grew up. Just like every other dumb American kid, I was watching television when I came home from school for at least a couple of hours. And I didn't realize till years later that some of the music on the background of those Bugs Bunny cartoons or the Betty Boop cartoons, one of the things that made those cartoons so wonderful was the music was fantastic. And I didn't realize till I was an adult, well, that's because the music, but it was all jazz. And it wasn't just having a jazz soundtrack, it was avant-garde jazz that the Fleischer brothers were using. They would have like Louis Armstrong and
Like Artie Shaw and
people like that. I mean,
Yeah.
people on the cutting edge, the real innovators of the jazz medium, they tapped them to do the soundtracks for their cutting edge cartoons. After all, this was the cutting edge animation of the day. This is decades before Pixar came along and digitized it all and has having computers doing it. And now it's almost starting to look more and more like AI when you look at these Pixar cartoons. But no, these were all hand-drawn, very handmade works of art. Same thing with Bugs Bunny. I mean, Fleischer, Betty Boop, and Bimbo the Clown, they were back in the 1930s. Bugs Bunny came along in the 1940s. The World War II years is when the best Bugs Bunny cartoons were coming out. And one of the things, in addition to the amazing animation, which I don't think has ever been as good as it's been in Bugs Bunny, but or as funny as in Bugs Bunny, but the soundtrack, the music going on in the background, it's people like it's Raymond Scott, who composed that tune, the jazz tune Powerhouse that other people cover. He also was playing different versions of Ellington. There'd be Ellington riffs that we'd be hearing. Just all the Bugs Bunny cartoons had kind of George Gershwin, Ellington influenced music, but it was definitely jazz, and it was definitely the cutting edge jazz.
Interesting. So that's the music that inspired you.
That's right. And Raymond Scott composed Powerhouse, and then Carl Stallings. If you look at any of those Bugs Bunny or any of the Warner Brothers cartoons, it always has music by Carl Stallings. And he would incorporate jazz into all of the soundtracks.
Are you hearing jazz in your head when you're doing these books, these illustrations? Are you hearing that?
I didn't even realize. I didn't realize that some of the first music I was getting was jazz. It wasn't until like I think Rubber Soul and Revolver came out that I started buying the Beatles. The Beatles, listening to the Beatles out of the radio. That's my generation. I got to hear Motown and the Rolling Stones when it was coming out of the AM radio.
Yeah.
And that's fantastic. That's music. All that music is about, I thought was about as good as music gets.
Because I had you pegged as like a Velvet Underground guy.
That's right. Well, I discovered that years later. As a teenager, I started to listen to Lou Reed and all of that stuff.
Do you listen to music when you're illustrating? Does that inspire you to?
Frequently, yes. I'd say most of the time when I'm at the drawing board or at the easel, I'm painting a picture. Yeah, 9 times out of 10, I'm listening to something, and I have the volume cranked up real loud.
Yes.
And have the bass cranked way, way up high. If I get in a mood where I'm writing the dialogue to one of the characters in one of these graphic novels. I don't want to listen to someone singing. It's distracting to hear the lyrics of Lou Reed singing to you about heroin, or he's on some clipper ship somewhere. I just listen to purely instrumental music then. And even then, if I'm writing something and the words are really important, I won't be able to listen to music at all. I'll just put on some kind of ambient sound, which isn't even quite music. It's just some kind of rhythmic droning sound that's not going to be throwing off my just the rhythm, the music of the language. When you write words, dialogue, it's almost a form of poetry. You don't have to be William Shakespeare to realize that once you're writing, there's definitely a rhythm. Good writing has a rhythm to it. And it doesn't have a lot of extraneous notes like good music. It's just cutting to the chase, just telling you that melody, giving you that line. And it's a real catchy melody. And then it comes back. We come back to it.
There's nothing like an old 40s film noir where they're playing the jazz in the background, New York City, black and white.
That's right. So that's the music, unwittingly, that music that, my parents would be watching some old black and white film noir on their black and white TV set in the 1960s or 1970s when I was a kid. And I could follow the storyline, typically went over my head, but I was enjoying the music, or I was haunted. Often I was haunted by the music. I noticed that, whoa, that's a really strange melody that they would have. Even some of the Bugs Bunny cartoons, this Raymond Scott thing that I was mentioning, Powerhouse. Do you know that? Look up. Anyone look up. You pause this podcast.
Yeah.
Go to YouTube. Type in Powerhouse by Raymond Scott, and you'll recognize it right away. It was used in many Bugs Bunny and Warner Brothers cartoons.
Powerhouse, Raymond Scott.
Whenever someone is working in a factory or anything mechanistic or industrial is happening, you'll hear this dun 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 dun.
All right, wait a minute, here we go. Oh, hold on, they're playing a commercial first on YouTube. Yeah, I got it here though. Here we go. That's it.
Yeah. Let this play. It takes a while to get into the recognizable riff, but all of this part is great too.
Oh yeah.
Cartoon music.
Ah.
Yeah, but it's jazz.
It is jazz.
It's avant-garde jazz.
The Raymond Scott Quintet. Wow.
Yeah. Leave it on for a couple of minutes. Wait till we get to the good part.
Yeah.
Even this is familiar. People watch a lot of Warner Brothers cartoons.
Yep.
It's just very animated music.
This is the 30s, right?
30s, 40s. Yeah, it's all saxophones, trumpets, trombones. It's black music.
Yeah, listen to that drummer.
Okay, check this out.
Oh, yes. Oh, I love it. I can almost hear Mel Blanc's voice.
Yeah.
So how tight that band is too. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
So it does
Such
music
intricate
get much
song
better than
structure.
that.
Yeah, it doesn't
Yeah,
get
so
better
I
than
got
that.
I got to just hear that in my childhood.
Wow.
Going on in the background with the cartoons. So I got lucky, Some of the best music ever recorded was just being used in the cartoons back. So that influenced me in ways that I didn't even realize. This is years before I discovered Velvet Underground or Pink Floyd or this other music that we all know and love. But it was really my introduction to jazz. So when I'm painting or drawing now, I'm often listening to that kind of music, jazz, Duke Ellington, or just bebop music.
Glenn Miller was the one my dad turned me on to. Glenn Miller is
all of
hands
that
down
stuff.
my favorite.
Benny
Yeah.
Goodman,
Benny Goodman,
John Coltrane, Charlie Parker, all of that good stuff. But the
Timeless.
first time I heard any of it was really back as, 4 or 5-year-old kid was coming out of the TV set.
Booked on Rock Podcast. We'll be back after this.
Think about the future.
Who is this guy?
I don't know. Until we find out, keep a lid on it.
And there are many love songs, which leads us to Alex. Isabel meets Alex along the way. Who's Alex, and how does she influence Isabel in her art?
The street dancer who Isabel encounters one night. She's out there after midnight playing her guitar on the street. People are occasionally dropping coins into her hat, but she's out there and it's getting windy and cold and the crowd is thinning out. And just as she's starting to wonder if, hey, this is getting to be pretty late and it's getting pretty cold out here, someone starts dancing around to the music, like someone starts break dancing to her music and dancing all up and down the sidewalk. Amazing street dancer. And that's how she befriends the Alex, who introduces himself. Says, "Hey, I love your music. I love your voice. I love your deep voice. I love a girl with a deep voice. Can I buy you a beer?" She walks to the bar right on the corner. They sit down. They get friendly, and they go home together that night. And this relationship kind of blossoms in the second chapter. But then there's some very unexpected things happen. And, well, there's a bit of a love triangle between Alex, the dancer, Isabel, the singer, and then the painter, who's in love with Isabel. So there's that. But then things start to get really unexpected when we meet the squeegee man, the window washer, who's been watching everything silently through the windows as he cleans everyone's windows. And it turns out that he's a type of artist in his own right.
Is Alex male or female? Because I thought at first male, and then I'm like, okay, wait a minute.
Yeah, well, it's not so clear.
Okay, I just want to make sure.
Referred to as a he, and his name is Alex after all. But after a while, and then when Alex is posing for the painter, doing some nude poses, wait a minute.
Okay.
What's going on? And then we remember that...
Because I'm like, am I missing something here?
Well, for people who know comics, Crazy Cat, which was big in the 1920s, sometimes Crazy Cat would be a he, sometimes Crazy Cat would be a she. It wasn't clear. Crazy Cat was of indeterminate gender.
How
Even
very
Bugs
2024,
Bunny,
though, that it's you're
Bugs
not
Bunny,
sure.
Bugs also kept you guessing at times. I mean, he was naked, right? You couldn't really see what was going on. And I think that was one of the things that they were playing around with then was gender, and how the whole thing is so artificial anyway, how it's such a mainstream kind of a well, a convention, but then these artists and trickster characters, feel have always felt free to play around with that or keep people guessing. Or, or
Wow.
pretend to be one thing and then turn out to be the other thing
Yes.
as a survival mechanism, if nothing else.
Well, Alex mentioned something to the painter. When Alex does pose nude, Alex says, quote, making art is simply making the invisible visible. What does that statement mean to you?
Well, I think that Marcel Duchamp said that, the old surrealist. I think that's it's a famous quote in artist circles. There are many definitions of art. What is art? Art, well, it's very simple. An artist's job is simply making the invisible visible. Oh, well, that sounds very simple and straightforward until you try to do it yourself, right? So it's an homage. A lot of these it gets more philosophical as it goes on, as we get into the nature of an art and who's an artist and who's just cleaning windows with a squeegee. That squeegee man who calls himself Mr. Nobody, he turns out to be a very artistic soul.
Yeah.
And he's such an artist that he doesn't even need to be drawing or painting or making music, because to him, everything is just a work of art. If we just keep our eyes open and our ears open, it's all just one, it's a symphony that's his approach to life. He ends up being really the secret hero of the story by the final chapter.
Yeah, he seems to know more than everybody else, and at least more than what they thought they knew. He's
the only one who has any real angle on things. He's a little bit older and more experienced, and he's had some hard times. Let's just say he's had a great fall.
The use of weather, the winter blizzard, the use of weather in the story, that's interesting. At the end,
snow. It's raining. There's an electrical storm somewhere in the middle of the story. Well, that all creates mood, right? When you're in a certain mood and you've got the blues, you'll call it the blues. See, that's why they call that whole art form the blues. Or you'll be in a stormy mood that there's so many songs that talk about the weather. Well, the song Stormy Weather, the Billie Holiday song. So in a work of visual art, likewise, you'll use this. These are some of the tools and tricks that the artist will use to create the mood that the artist is in, to put the reader into the headspace of the different characters. It'll be the lighting, the angle that the lighting is hitting the character. Is it hitting them in the face, or is it from behind? Are they in shadow? Are they cold? Are they shivering? Is it in the middle of winter? Is it a warm summer day with all the trees in bloom? So we go through the full range. It's really, the whole story takes place in about 1 year. She hitchhikes to New York on a cold winter day, and then the final chapter is also late December. She says it's winter solstice is when she gives her final concert. The shortest day of the year, whenever December 21st, the longest night of the year. So that's the format of the story. If people are curious, if they look at my website, I give a lot of examples, so you could get a sneak preview of what the pictures look like. I think I show the first 5 or 6 pages right on the landing page. It's just my last name, Drooker, Drooker.com.
Drooker.com, and I can put some of those images up on the video version of this interview too.
There's
and
lots, all of them New Yorker covers. You'll recognize a lot of I'm best known for I've done 40 New Yorker covers through the decades, so that's what I'm best known for.
Yeah.
But it's these books that I think that are really my labor of love. And Naked City is hot off the press, and it speaks to a lot about this moment that we all find ourselves in now. Artists, people trying to support themselves through their creativity, or any working person who's trying to support themselves and pay their rent, which is all of us. I think everyone would relate and identify with the characters in this story.
I know I sure do. And people will have to read to find out what happens to Isabel. Does she make it? What happens? She's got quite a journey.
There's a lot of twists and turns.
A lot of twists and turns. So the book is out. People can get it on Amazon. They could probably get it through your website too.
You could get it if you want a signed copy, and I'll draw a special little original work of art just for you if you buy it through my website, Drooker.com. I'm selling hundreds of them through the website, but it's in your local bookstore. Anywhere where books are sold, you could walk in. If they don't have it, you could order it from your local bookstore or anywhere online. But it's out there. It's Dark Horse is the publisher. Dark Horse Books, which is a big graphic novel publisher. And they did a great job with this one. Beautiful.
Fantastic job. Eric Drooker, thanks for being on. All the best with the book. And again,
Eric,
congratulations.
Thank you for having me. We got to stick together from now on.
That's right. Eric with a C. And next time you read about cats and Jammer, you'll now remember, hey, I spoke with somebody who was related
that goes
to
back
one.
over a century. Yes, right. That's right.
Man. All right, Eric, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. To be continued. All power to the imagination.
That's it. It's in the books.